Julie Williams, my co-chair, and I are just thrilled about tonight's lecture and conversation with Ron Lieber speaking to all of us about helping our children develop a healthy relationship with money. So as a team, the Parent Education Speakers group, those of us who come together each year and determine what topics we want to address, we all decided that this would be a worthwhile topic last spring. We felt that it was one of those topics that we don't openly discuss and that we hadn't ever presented before. So we said, let's try it. And I went out and I looked for folks who were researching the topic or were experts in it already. And I encountered this lovely sociologist at the University of Virginia. Her name is Allison Pugh. And we started talking, and she told me about her research. And originally, her research had been about the emotional uses of money and how similar they actually were between families of affluent families and less privileged families. It was a really interesting finding. So she was telling me about that, and she said, I'd love to come and speak to you, but actually the person you should be speaking to is Ron Lieber, because he's writing a book right now called The Opposite of Spoiled, and it is about exactly what you want to address with your community. And so I said, thank you so much, and I basically picked up the phone and called Ron. And so a little bit about Ron. Since 2008, Ron Lieber has been the Your Money columnist for the New York Times, where his columns about student loans won the 2011 Loeb Award, business journalism's highest honor in the personal finance category. Before coming to the Times, he wrote for the Wall Street Journal's Money and Investing section and was part of the startup team at the paper's personal journal section in 2002. He's also been on staff of Fortune and Fast Company magazines. His first book, Taking Time Off, Inspiring Stories of Students Who Enjoyed Successful Breaks from College and How You Can Plan Your Own, was a New York Times bestseller in 1996. His latest book, The Opposite of Spoiled, is a practical guidebook for parents who want to use conversations about money to imprint good values. It covers all the basics that people have been writing and asking Ron about for years, things about the best way to handle the tooth fairy or allowance or chores or cars or cell phones. But in the course of all of that, he also identified a set of virtues and character traits like modesty, patience, generosity, and perspective that all parents hope their kids will carry out with them into the world. And I learned something great tonight, which is in its first week of release, it was released on February 3rd, the book made both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal's bestseller lists. So congratulations to Ron on that. So Ron is a graduate of Francis W. Parker in Chicago and Amherst College. He lives in Park Slope with his wife and his daughter, and we welcome him tonight to speak to us about The Opposite of Spoiled.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. It's a thrill to be here. I've never been to Calabasas before. This school smells just as good as all of the other California schools smell. I go outside and I inhale the eucalyptus, evergreen, jasmine. I don't know what this magic combination of stuff is that you have here in California, but it makes everything smell great. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming out. I know weeknights are tough. Please do not put your cell phones away. I know kids may be texting you for help with math homework or whatever else that they need. No problem at all. I've been there. I've done it. If you feel like tweeting out anything that I say that's particularly interesting or provocative or outrageous or ridiculous, by all means do that. My handle's @RonLieber. And one more bit of business in case some of you have to leave before you go. Some of you may have already purchased books or are going to purchase them on the way out. I encourage you to do that. I'm partnering with an organization called Donors Choose, which is a nonprofit that helps public school teachers post projects on the website that other people, donors, can come and pay for. It's a great way to give with kids. Kids particularly love going on there and finding things that they love to do and helping other kids who may not have as much money in their classroom or in their school system do some of the things that they see as fun. So for every book you buy tonight, you'll get a $27 Donors Choose gift card. That's the same price as the cover price of the book. You can take that home, you can hoard it for yourself, or if you have a child or children at home, you can bring them in on the fun and help them give that money away. So thanks for supporting that cause. So I want to start tonight by telling you a story of how this boy with a lot more hair became this guy with a little less hair who was obsessed with money and families and all of the conversations that families have about money. And these conversations and this obsession started with my own family. I went to a school a lot like this one in Chicago, a K through 12 school, strong community bonds. And all was well until about middle school. And then my parents got divorced. If any of you have been through that, you know that it can be a difficult situation financially. You take one household and you turn it into two households, and often there's a decline in the standard of living for both. And right around that same time, one of my parents lost their job. It was about 10 or 15 years until my family was back again to where it had been economically. The school completely closed ranks around all of us. My brother, my sister, and I, we all went on scholarship. It was almost completely seamless. But when it came time to apply to college, I knew we would be navigating the financial aid system. And we really did not know anything about it. And so my mother, somehow, I still don't know quite how she figured this out, she found the name of a guy who was the assistant dean of financial aid at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, about 20 miles north of where we lived in Chicago. And one night, she put me in the front seat of the car, and off we went up to Northwestern. And it turns out that what this guy was doing was that every day at 5:01, he'd usher a family in. He'd close the door behind him to his office after all of his colleagues left and no one could see. He locked the door. You would drop about $100 in cash on the table, and he would spend the next hour with you explaining the ins and outs and the intricacies of the financial aid system. Now, nothing he was encouraging us to do was illegal. He was just explaining how the system worked, ways in which you might move money or spend money or save money differently so that the financial aid folks might not take as much of it in the future. Now, whether Northwestern had any idea what he was doing, I do not know. We did not ask. And believe it or not, his name has been lost to history, so I can't go back and thank him for all of the good that he did for us. But there was a lesson in that for me that lasted a lifetime. And what I learned from that was a couple of things. That first of all, that there were all sorts of complicated financial systems and complex systems in general in the world that involved money, and that they were made to be hacked. That there were people out there who could help you hack them, and that you could figure out how to beat those systems in ways that were perfectly legal. The other thing I learned from the way my mother handled it was that it was perfectly fine to bring kids in on complex matters of money, that it was okay to be transparent, that in fact it was good for kids to learn exactly where the family stood so they would have a better sense of what their choices are and what sort of limits there might be on those choices. None of this really made sense to me in terms of how it impacted me until much later. Flash forward 10 or 12 years or so, and I went to work for the Wall Street Journal. This was 2002. They were starting their consumer news sections called Personal Journal. And they hired me because of my obsession with the frequent flyer mile. I'd spent much of the 1990s traveling around, doing magazine work, giving speeches. I was involved in a long-distance relationship with someone who lived on the West Coast, and I really learned to exploit all of the loopholes in the airline's frequent flyer mile system. And the people at the Wall Street Journal knew this about me, and they thought that was interesting, but that wasn't going to make up an entire year's worth of stories. And what they said to me after I got there, what they saw in me that I had not seen in myself, they said, "Ron, you're a person whose newspaper beat, but also whose beat in life is beating the system." And so I became the person who wrote the stories about how to return all of your wedding gifts for cash. Did you return your wedding gifts for cash? You put them in the trash. So yeah, it turns out that it's possible to do this at some number of stores. This information was sort of traded on the kind of wedding underground, but I brought it out into the open. And my mother is a personal shopper at Neiman Marcus in Chicago, and you would not believe the number of bold-faced billionaire family names where the kids have, you know, $200 or $300 or $400,000 fancy weddings at the Drake Hotel, and they get $20 or $30 or $40,000 worth of gifts from Neiman Marcus, and then they bring them all back and drop them on the counter and take the cash and go. She won't let me reveal the names, but trust me, it goes on. And so I ran off a string of stories like that. Eventually, the Wall Street Journal started a Saturday paper for the first time, and they made me a personal finance columnist because this, to them, was personal finance. My beat was beating the system, and they thought readers would benefit from that. A couple years later, I moved to the New York Times and became the personal finance columnist there. I thought I was on top of the world, but then I became a parent. And there's nothing to shake up your worldview like becoming a dad or a mom for the very first time. Within a couple of years, our daughter was asking us very complicated questions about money, about what we had and who had what, and why we didn't have a summer house, and why we couldn't have a basement in our third-floor apartment so that we could have toys downstairs the way that some of her friends and family members did in the suburbs. And they weren't incredibly difficult questions, but I found myself strangely tongue-tied. I play this financial expert, this money guy in the newspaper each and every Saturday. And even during 2008 and 2009, when it seemed like the world was circling the toilet drain, I had some pretty good answers for most of the questions that readers had. But I was having a really hard time with my 3- and 4-year-old daughter. And I tried to figure out why that was, and it seemed like a couple things were going on. When kids persist with these questions about money to us, a couple things happen. First of all, money questions and money conversations are hard. They bring up all sorts of feelings about how much we have and whether we have enough and whether we've done enough and whether we can provide enough and what sort of security we have and how our parents raised us and all these deep-rooted feelings. So some of that was going on. But then when it comes to parenting, that's its own set of emotional complications. These are kids who are our flesh and blood, or we have taken them in and make them our own. And we want to do the best by them. We want to imprint them with all of our very best virtues and none of the things that we don't like about ourselves. So that's a lot of pressure when those kids ask us those money questions. And so I did what I normally do these days when I'm having trouble figuring something out. I turned to the community. I turned to the internet. And I started posting some of these questions on the New York Times' website. And I would propose some answers and then invite readers to come in to, in effect, correct my scripts. And over the course of several months, really a couple of years by the time it was done, we had some pretty good answers to a lot of these questions, both my daughters and those of other people who were reading along. So that was right around the time that Occupy Wall Street started up. And right then, I heard from a couple of parents in the community, and they said, "Ron, we have a problem here, and we're hoping you can help. The people who have more in our community are starting to feel demonized. The school is coming to them and saying, you really need to tone it down. The birthday parties need to be less extravagant. You can't take kids away on vacation and have them all come and talk about it because the other kids feel badly, and they shouldn't be coming to school in taxi cabs, and it all just needs to be a little more low-key." And that didn't feel very good to those folks because they felt like they were having to apologize not just for what they had, but really who they were. And the people with less, they didn't like it much either because they felt like their noses were being rubbed in everybody else's affluence. And they particularly didn't like the questions that were coming home from their kids. Their kids would look at them and say, "Why did you decide to be a teacher? Or a funeral director, or a psychologist, or a journalist, God forbid, when you could have been an investment banker, or a Hollywood studio executive, or a venture capitalist?" And so the parents were pretty annoyed that the kids were asking these questions, And they were also kind of annoyed at the school, because to the extent that these schools have diversity curriculums, they mostly talk about race. They don't really talk about social class. And it's a convenient dodge, right? Because race, most often, although not always, race is something that we wear on our skin. Our differences are apparent often, and it's difficult to avoid talking about them or noticing them. Social class, you can't always tell. And in an institution like this, or the one where I grew up, or the one where we send our daughter now, it's very easy to avoid the uncomfortable conversation where we all admit to one another, yeah, actually, we can afford to write the $30,000 or $40,000 check each year, or we're getting financial aid to do that, and we're all privileged to be able to do that, and in fact, maybe we're more privileged than the people who can't afford it. Nobody wants to have that conversation. It's uncomfortable. So I understood where these parents were coming from, but then they said to me, Ron, you've been writing about all this stuff, so why don't you come speak to all of those parents, the ones with more, the ones with less, and you can set everybody straight. So immediately I said yes. This felt like a fundamentally new personal finance question to me. We know the basics. Spend less than you make, put as much money away as you can, leave it there for 40 years to grow in the stock market. Get some insurance, have your estate plans in place, prepay for a funeral plot, all the things that you're supposed to do. But this felt new, this kids and money stuff, the parenting, the values. It felt like a new question to me, one that I wanted to try and answer. And so I asked myself, just as a thought exercise, to try and figure out what all these parents had in common. I asked myself, well, what is the single worst word that someone could use, theoretically, to describe my child that would be the single biggest indictment of my own parenting? The single word that somebody might use to describe my child that would be the single worst indictment of my parenting. And the first thing that sprang to my mind was spoiled. And I think the reason why was that I knew right away that it wasn't just an adjective, it's a passive verb, right? Spoiled by whom? Spoiled by you, usually, or me. It's the parents. Kids aren't born that way, they are made. So I asked around, and I got a few different answers. Sometimes people would say mean, sometimes people would say racist. I asked my mother what she thought. Mom, what's the word that would be most insulting to you if people used it to describe us? She looked at me with great alarm and she said, average. That's my mother for you. But at least half the people who I spoke to said spoiled. Now, I thought that was a pretty bad word. It was a word that made the hairs rise up on my arm. Not everybody feels that way. This is a T-shirt that a friend of mine got from their financial advisor when her son was born. I don't know what sort of message he was trying to send. I mean, if you spend money spoiling your child, you're going to have less money for the advisor to invest. So that doesn't make any sense. And then there's some people who name their stores after spoiled children. This is a real store in suburban New York City, and not Westchester County or Short Hills or the fancier parts of New York City. This is an hour and a half out of the city. I still don't know what these folks were thinking. No great surprise, this chain has not swept the nation, and I don't think it's going to. But for the rest of us, the word spoiled is a problem. And so I tried to figure out, okay, well, if that's what we're trying to solve for, then what's the opposite of spoiled? And that wasn't useful at first, right? Because if you look in the thesaurus, for the opposite of spoiled, you get fresh. And we're not talking about produce here or meat or anything like that. We're talking about kids. And so I made a list of all the values and virtues and character traits that add up to the opposite of spoiled. Modesty, patience, thrift, prudence, delayed gratification, curiosity, perspective on your place in the world, generosity, all that good stuff that adds up to the decent, grounded kinds of kids that we want to shove out into the world eventually. And I looked at that list, and I thought, whoa, you can use money as a teaching tool to teach every single one of these things. And so rather than assume that these questions about money that kids ask, that if we answer them, that if we talk a lot about money, that will somehow subvert their values or turn them into money-grubbing kids? What if we did the reverse? What if we assumed that those questions are great ways to lead to long conversations that we can steer eventually to all of these values and virtues and character traits? What if we did that instead? And so I went and I spoke to those parents who invited me. And so many of them came up to me afterwards and said, this is really neat. You're going to have to come back here in a couple of years when you've written the book. And I sort of looked at them funny, but after the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth person came up and said the same thing, I realized that I had stumbled into something very important. And so off I went, and here I am. The opposite of spoiled to me is first and foremost a generational manifesto. It's a promise to our children that we will do better at this money stuff, at answering their questions in a transparent, open way than our parents ever did. That we will honor their curiosity because it's their job to ask these questions. We're in the adult-making business, and it's their job to figure out how the world works. Money, it's a source of great mystery and power, so it's only natural that they will ask us about it. Now, how many of you asked your parents questions about money when you were younger and got a response that went something like this? None of your business. Yes, all right, I see a whole bunch of hands going up, right? So there's a bunch of problems with that response, and the first one is that it's literally not true, right? If you're a member of the household, if you're a member of the family, its business is your business. The family's revenue and expenses have a direct impact on you. And so I don't see how you can say that with a straight face because it's not actually honest. But the bigger problem with that kind of response is that it serves to shut kids down. The message they get away is that, the message they take away is that their curiosity is not honored, that it's not respected, that it's not welcome, that hard questions will be met with a stone wall, and ultimately, parents really should not be the source of important information about crucial questions about which you're greatly curious. And so instead, maybe you should go to Google or go to your friends or go to somebody else, but your parents are not going to talk to you about this important matter, and maybe they won't talk to you about sex either, or drugs, or other controversial things, because the message that you're sending is that, when the questions get hard, we're just not going to talk about it because it's too complicated or emotionally messy. Other parents don't want to talk about financial issues because of shame. Maybe they're ashamed of being found out because they're in debt, or because they spend more than they think they should, or maybe they're ashamed because they don't know very much and they don't understand how they could possibly teach something to their kids about this important topic. And then there are the people who just want to protect their kids a little bit longer from all of this money stuff, keep them innocent. And I think that's a lovely protective instinct, but I also think that it's naive. Starting from the age of 3, kids notice who has less and who has more. Social scientists have proved it. When kids look at pictures of other children their age as young as 3, and some of them are dressed nicely and some of them are dressed not as nice, it's clear right away to the kids who are being tested, these 3-year-olds, who has less and who has more. And nearly 100% of the kids, when asked who they'd like to play with, want to play with the kids with more things or nicer clothes. So they're paying attention, they're sizing people up. And once they can read, all bets are off. They can read the billboards by the side of the highway, they read the headlines, they look at your mail, they go snooping through your tax returns, which I did when I was in middle school. Trying to keep all this stuff from them is probably hopeless. So we're going to have these conversations. And this is sort of the basic foundation for beginning them. If you want to have allowance, if you want to start allowance, which I encourage everyone to do, maybe you start at the age of 4 or 5 or 6 with $4 or $5 or $6 a week. You can put it into 3 jars. And I like the 3-jar approach for a couple of reasons. At a very basic level, it mimics what adults do with their budgets. If you have a reasonably healthy financial life, you're probably spending, maybe 75, 80, 85% of what you make Hopefully you're saving 10 or 15 or 20% if you can afford to for retirement or for college or maybe for a down payment if you don't have a home yet. And then whatever you have left, you try to give to people who have less than you do. And maybe it's 2.5% if you're an average American, or maybe if you're a Mormon and you tithe, that's 10%. Or maybe there's people in this room who've signed the giving pledge and plan to give away 50% of their net worth. Whatever it is, hopefully you have something left over. So it's a basic beginning grown-up budget. Kids can do the same thing. But I also like the way that these jars stand in for the values. Spending is really about modesty, it's about thrift, and it's about prudence. Not about being cheap, but being smart enough to know what the things are that bring you the most joy. And spending lavishly on those to the extent that you can, and not doing mindless wallet dives into things that don't really matter or don't create lasting memories. Saving, it's patience, it's delayed gratification in a world that really conspires against waiting, right? Kids can, suck down the latest book or movie or TV show. Nobody has to go to Blockbuster and get on the wait list anymore. There are more bathrooms in homes. Kids don't share. Everybody walks around with a private line in their pocket. If you want to, you can pay your way to the front of the line at Magic Mountain and not have to wait, with all of the rest of the kids. It's possible to avoid waiting, in almost every way, shape, and form, unless you are on the freeway. Nobody's figured out a way to stop the waiting there. But saving is good. Kids should learn to wait. It's an important skill to learn because one day they're going to need to save for retirement. And giving, of course, is about generosity and really ultimately about gratitude. So when you start to break down spending, grown-up spending and grown-up spending on kids, and eventually kids' own spending, I think it's helpful to start with a basic understanding of wants and needs. Several years ago, I got to interview Elmo from Sesame Street when they were about to start a financial literacy initiative on the show. And the Children's Television Workshop, which produces Sesame Street, they are filled with sort of propeller head, PhD child development folks. They spent years on this and determined that kids as young as 3 absolutely can understand the difference between wants and needs. So, by all means, by the time your child is 5 or 6 or 7 and they're starting allowance, they're ready to have this conversation. Here's what I encourage parents to do, in every category of spending, is to draw a horizontal line for anything that you're talking about with your child, with need at one end and want at the other. Rain boots is the example that I use, just because these hunter boots, no one here is wearing hunter boots tonight, right? There's no rain in the forecast? Okay, good. Yeah, occasionally there will be people with hunter boots, and then I have to apologize ahead of time that I don't really disapprove of grown-ups wearing hunter boots, or even kids most of the time. But hunter boots are a luxury product. $70, $80, $90, $100 for the kids' version of those rain boots. That's a want. Over here on the left, we have a need. In most parts of the country, although maybe not here, kids need rain boots. These are the $20 wellies. And so what I encourage parents to do is draw a vertical line through the want-need continuum wherever you are on that line where you are willing to spend. And so I'm from the Midwest. Land's End is a sort of stalwart of this Wisconsin economy. I've been buying and wearing their clothes for decades. I'm wearing one of their shirts right now. And Land's End to me stands for high quality merchandise, great customer service, nice return policy, and good, slightly above mid-priced clothing. And so what we do in our house is that we draw the line at Land's End. And so whatever the Land's End price would be for the rain boots, that's what we pay. So call it $40 or $45. We would pay for that. If our daughter decided she wanted hunter boots at $70 or $80 or $90, then she would pay for the difference, for everything to the right of the Land's End line. So that would be on her, $30, $40. It would have to come from allowance, from savings, from birthday money. You can do this for any category of spending. You can do it for athletic equipment. You can do it for gym shoes. You can do it for musical instruments, whatever it is that's on your list. And it's a good exercise to go through with kids. And that vertical line, it can be all sorts of places on the continuum. You may have a Target or a Walmart line for underwear. But if yours is a family that goes camping a lot, you may have a Patagonia line or an REI line way over here for a rain jacket. It just depends on what sorts of things that you like to do and what your kids are into and what your budget is. But it's perfectly fine to have lines that are all over the map. So I first started thinking about this several years ago, and I was giving a talk once, and a mother came up to me after the talk, and she said, well, I have a problem because my son came to me recently and he stumped me and he said, I don't understand why I can't have a carnivorous plant terrarium if you're willing to pay for my sister's hunter boots. And I thought this was a great question because what the kid realized that the mother hadn't quite clued into was that the terrarium, that is a tool for learning, right? Botany and plant science and animal behavior, all this good stuff. He really wanted to learn, and who knows what it could have turned him onto. Hunter boots, they're a luxury product. Those two things don't really compare. So I said to the mother, I said, I don't really think this is a close call. Maybe you feel a little guilty for splurging on these fancy boots, but this kid clearly wants to learn, so I think you should buy him his Venus flytraps, but you should make him pay for the flies. And that was their solution. So, I wrote this hunter boot riff into my manuscript, and I had a first draft going, and, I thought I had things pretty well figured out. But then I came home one day this summer and found my daughter wearing these. I thought, how on earth did this happen? Because my wife knows that I have this thing about hunter boots, and so where on earth would she have gotten these? I thought maybe somebody was playing a practical joke. But the boots were there in the living room, and so I said, Talia, where did you get those boots? She looked at me and she said, oh, Grandmommy got them for me. Grandparents are a menace. They live to subvert every possible rule. They do it with glee. They take great pride on it. They think that's what they were put on the earth to do, present company accepted. And so we had a difficult conversation that night after our daughter went to bed about whether we were going to keep these things. Now, a couple of years before, the other grandmother had unannounced sent our daughter a leather miniskirt in the mail. Yeah, I had the same scrunched eyebrow reaction. That went right back to the store from whence it came. This was a closer call. We finally decided that, if she had decided on her own that she really wanted them, and she was willing to pay for the extra money to the right of the Land's End line, then we probably would have let her do it. And so we decided to let this go. Besides, we want them to enjoy their grandparents. As long as this sort of thing isn't going on once a week or once a day, the rules aren't being subverted on a regular basis. And I know that some of you probably have parents who provide who serve as a primary caregiver role or a primary after-school caregiver role, or maybe they live with you. Then it's an issue if your rules are not being enforced. But once in a while, we decided we could live with it, especially because we want our daughter to hang out with her grandparents as much as she wants to, because that gives us a little more time to ourselves. So we let this one go. And so I was out talking about this 2 weeks ago at my alma mater in Chicago. And a couple hours later, this picture shows up on Facebook in the thread where my classmates were discussing the talk that I had given. And on the way home, my classmate, Cullen, his wife, had pulled those out of a shopping bag, literally on the way home from the talk. And Cullen said, oh no. He said, you did not buy hunter boots for our 3-year-old daughter. And his wife said, no, it's not a problem. She said they were on sale, so they were to the left of the Land's End line. So they got a pass on that one. So that's the want-need continuum. I also encourage parents to talk with their kids about giving as much as possible. You saw the give chart for allowance. Kids are capable of all sorts of acts of generosity. Many people wonder whether it's okay to force them to give, but in fact they want to. Before they go through the sort of grabby, biting toddler phase where they scratch and kick and take things from one another, these are the same kids who take the grimy Cheerios out of their mouth after they've been sucking on them and hand them over to you and expect you to eat it. right? They enjoy giving. They're hardwired for generosity. And so it's good to have them give with their allowance money and give them some license and agency to give to people or places that move them. Maybe it's a children's museum or the local park or the local zoo. A lot of kids enjoy giving to animal organizations. This is all great. But I think eventually, by the time they are 7 or 8 or 9, they're ready to be brought in on the family giving conversation. Last year, we sat our daughter down and we explained to her how it was that we divide our charitable giving. And the way we represented this is that we put 100 black beans on the dining room table, and then we started dividing them up. And we explained to her that for every $100 that we give away, this is how we divide it. And so $17 goes to river blindness, a devastating disease. It's relatively easy to fix and solve for and inoculate for. If any of you have read Peter Singer, The Life You Can Save, has anybody read that book? An incredible book that changed our view on philanthropy. His point is that you should give as much as you possibly can to people way far away from you in the world for whom the most basic of preventable diseases are actually killing them. Because with just a little bit of money, you can actually guarantee that you will save a life. And a lot of these organizations can now say with a fair bit of authority and a lot of research behind them that with I think it's $150 to the leading river blindness organization, you can be sure statistically that you will save somebody's life. And there's no greater gift to give than that. And so we give to river blindness. But we also give to the schools that I attended that helped me out with financial aid. We come from a family of Holocaust survivors, so we make sure to take care of the elderly Jews in our community. My mother is a 40-year survivor of premenopausal breast cancer, so we throw some coins in that bucket, and on and on and on. Local organizations that help the hungry. And so we said to our daughter, is there anything missing here? Do you think it's fair the way that we've divided these beans up? And she took a look at this, and you'll notice there's one thing up there that's in a different handwriting. It stands on its own. She said, I think it's great that we give money to the organizations that help, to the schools that helped Dad when his family didn't have enough money. She said, the thing that I love the most that I do each year is to go to overnight camp. She said, I want to give money to the camp so that if there are some kids who don't have enough money, that they can go too. That was not a leap that we had thought to make. It was not a leap that we suggested that she make. It was a leap that she made because we sort of splayed all this out for her. We explained to her what it was that we stood for, that I felt a debt of gratitude to the institutions that supported me, that there were, in fact, kids who could not afford to pay for school or for camp, and that others were willing to give to help those kids have those same experiences. And she put all that together and figured out that there must be some kind of scholarship fund at her camp. And in fact, there was. And so she chose which beans to move from which piles to put in the scholarship fund. And so I'm here to tell you today that if you do the same exercise with your kids or your grandkids, you will find that they have ideas of their own, and they may well be better than yours. It's only one short step from generosity to gratitude. Gratitude comes in part from knowing that you can give in the first place, that you're lucky enough to have a bit extra, and that you're able to throw the rope back for others who may not have as much as you. In the last 10 or 20 years, there's been an incredible amount of research. Much of it's been collected and also sort of completed in the first place by an organization called the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California at Berkeley. Does anyone here get their email newsletters? If you don't, you should. It's incredible stuff. It's all about sort of the science of a meaningful life, is how they put it. They've done great work on gratitude rituals, saying grace, all of the things that can help families and help kids in particular realize how good they have it. Now, not every person, not every family is a person of faith or a family of faith. And even if you are, maybe you don't pray or say grace each night. And that's fine. Maybe you can't even get it together to eat dinner together as a family every night, or any night during the week, because everybody's schedule is so crazy. But when you do, when you can, it's a good idea to stop and pause and reflect and say something about what you're grateful for. We've tried a bunch of different rituals in our house, but the one that we've settled on is toasting. Kids really like the visceral nature of it, the clinking of the glasses and the sloshing of the liquid, and the slight sort of rowdiness. And it feels like adult behavior, grown-up behavior, things that they see in the movies. And we just do a round, and everybody raises their glass to something or someone, something that happened during the day that brightened the day for them, something that they were grateful for. People often ask me, what is the single best parenting tip that you have picked up in the course of your half a decade looking at all of this stuff? And the thing that I always say right away is that I go to gratitude. Not just the ritual, the toasting ritual that we do in our house, but my own private, personal gratitude ritual. It doesn't take very long. I usually do it in the morning as I'm standing at the subway stop waiting for the F train to come. And I'll just stop for 15 seconds and close my eyes and try and remember at least one thing from the previous day that was awesome. And even if I've had a terrible day, there's usually something I can think of right then and there. And I stand here today before you as a person who is probably 25% happier than I was 2 or 3 years ago when I started doing this. It really makes an appreciable difference. And I think it makes a difference for kids too. So people often ask me about the basics of allowance. And so let me just sort of lay it out to you, and we can talk in more detail about it during the Q&A. I think allowance and chores should not be connected. I think allowance is a tool for learning, that money is for practice, and it should stand in the same category of art supplies or books or musical instruments. These are not things that you would take away generally if the kids were not doing their chores. Chores, however, kids should do way more of them than we currently give them. They're capable of way more than we think they are, and I absolutely think that we should ask as much of them as possible, and we should not pay them a cent. It's what you do as a member of the household. The parents don't get paid, the kids shouldn't get paid. And so parents often ask me, well, what's my leverage here, right? If they won't do the chores, then what do I do? And privileges are the best things to take away when kids won't do their chores. I mean, most of them are motivated much more by screen time, car keys, Wi-Fi, Game Boys, whatever it is that they like doing the most, soccer practice, right? You're usually responsible for getting them there, or somebody is. If they can't do those things, that allows for much more leverage, I think, than taking away money. But again, that's not to say that they shouldn't do chores. They should do a lot of chores. And then to try and figure out where and who and what sort of family has the most kind of evolved means of getting the chores done, I went to visit Mormon families, because Mormons tend to have more kids than average, on average. And what I found were these incredible charts. This one comes from the Palmer family. They give points according to the number of chores that are done. They keep track of how engaged the kids are. There are different color-coded goals. All of the homework gets tracked. Different buttons have different inspirational sayings on them. And the chores themselves are incredibly detailed. I mean, they get very, very granular with this stuff. All right, so I don't know if any of you even know what an entry bench is. We don't have those in Brooklyn apartments. Maybe some of you do, but apparently they need to be dusted every day, and that's chore number 5 as opposed to chore number 15, as opposed to the door in between the mudroom and the kitchen that has to be washed on both sides. There's a lot of activity in this house. In fact, so much that the family decided to install a water fountain in between the mudroom and the kitchen. There were 6 kids. There's so much activity at the sink that they finally just decided enough, and there was going to be a separate water station for the kids. And so that's what they did. Really neat family. So parents often worry that if there isn't a direct connection made between chores and money, the kids will not learn a work ethic. Now, I think chores are a perfectly good way to learn a work ethic, but perhaps the best way is to do work for somebody else, somebody who's not related to you, somebody who won't give you a break or cut you slack, somebody that really doesn't care a lick about you and just wants the work to get done, and will fire you if you don't do it. We have a long history of kids doing work in America. Some of the history is not history that we're proud of. There are labor laws for a reason. But work, and teenage work in particular, has gone out of style. The percentage of teenagers who work has fallen in half in just the last 10 or 15 years. Now, this has happened for a couple of reasons. Some of them are macroeconomic, right? There are adults who are taking the jobs that kids used to have because they are hurting financially, and they're working a second job or a third job, and they're taking some of these jobs at the mall that maybe our kids once had. Graduated licensing requirements make it harder for kids to get home at night if they're not supposed to drive in the dark, which happens in certain states. But I blame, particularly in communities like this, the college admissions industrial complex for a lot of this. There is a sense out there, and it's an incorrect perception, that colleges devalue work. And they would much rather see kids captaining the soccer team or starring in the school play or doing student government or running the Latin club or doing Model UN or something extracurricular that's sort of within the school bubble. So I wondered about this because with so many more kids applying to so many more schools, I knew that a lot of these applications were starting to look the same. The essays were starting to look the same. And so I started to ask college admissions officers about this. And they said, yeah, I mean, imagine us sitting there at, it's March 26th, and we've got to pick, one kid out of every 5. And we've got a big, giant stack of applications over here at 11:30 at night that we have to go through. And all these essays are about losing the state championship or when my grandmother died or whatever. And they all sort of sound the same. And then there's a small stack over here with kids who have written about the jobs that they have done, or the jobs that they have invented if they're entrepreneurs, or work, or money and social class, and what it's like to have more and what it's like to have less. They don't get very many of these essays, and those applications actually stand apart. Work is an extracurricular activity too. What colleges want is demonstrated passion for something. And if it happens outside of the walls of the school, outside of the 40 acres of this campus, so be it. It's fine by them. They just want to know what makes you, you. The thing that makes you, the thing that makes your kid excited and passionate and makes them want to get out of bed in the morning. And so work is good. Kids want to work. They want to display their competence. And so, I learned this lesson from visiting with farm families. I wanted to understand just how much kids are actually capable of if we go back to sort of the old way of doing things. And so this is Zeb, short for Zebediah. He was 5 years old when I met him, and he's the youngest of 8 boys. They live on a dairy farm in northern Utah, right near the Idaho border. And starting at the age of 5, Zeb was lifted up, because he can't quite climb yet, because the tractor is so high, and he's placed on the seat of the tractor. And they turn the tractor on, and Zeb is the driver. It's 5:30 in the morning. Zeb takes the wheel. The tractor starts moving at 1 mile per hour, and down he goes the rows of calves, all of the baby cows. They all need to be fed. And there's Zeb holding the wheel, making sure the tractor stays straight. And behind him are the 7-year-old brother and the 9-year-old brother, and they're taking the bottles out of the back of the tractor, and they're dropping them in the slot so the calves can drink the milk out of the bottles. And the bottles were made by the 11-year-old and the 13-year-old back in the barn, because the 15 and the 17-year-olds had hooked all of the cows up to the milking machines. And this is what the Smith boys do every day and every afternoon after school, every morning, day in, day out, 6 days a week. They don't do it on Sundays. Zeb started at 5. He also got his first gun at 5. Now, this is a BB gun, but eventually he gets a more advanced piece of weaponry. There's an incredible intra-family trade in used weapons. They all sort of trade up, they trade down, they swap. But Zeb got his BB gun when he was 5, and it's a tool that he uses for his work. The birds around the farm, they really harass the cows. They spread disease. It's bad to have them around, and Zeb's job is to scare them. And so they now know when flat top Zeb shows up and he raises his BB gun and he starts firing and that noise comes, the birds know to scatter. Zeb's job is to make them afraid. And it's known around town, around the entire county, that if you've got work to do, that you've got a husband down or a wife down, or your kids are sick, or you're literally raising a barn, it's the Smith boys that you call because they know what it means to work. And so I thought to wonder, what would happen if more of us made our families more like farm families? If we assumed competence from the earliest possible age, taught our kids to do many of the tasks that we do ourselves, and in fact, expected it of them, then what would happen? So I get that not every family can be a farm family. And so another thing that parents often do to try and bring kids to a different way of thinking and a different way of being is to send them to summer camp, overnight camp. How many of you have kids who have gone to sleepaway camp or are contemplating sending yours? So at least half the room, right? Do any of them have bathrooms like this? Some of you have probably seen this before, but this is sort of the extreme version. And in fact, I went looking for it. I wanted to find the single camp in America that was most rustic. No power, no running water except in the kitchen, no dividers in the toilets, it turned out. I found this place in the middle of an island, in the middle of a lake, in the middle of the state of Maine. It's called Pine Island Camp. Are there any Pine Island campers here? I had one in San Francisco last week. I made him tell the whole story, but since there's no one here tonight, I'll tell it. So the thing about Pine Island, there's only 90 boys out there at any given time. And the only fun that happens at Pine Island is really the fun that the boys create themselves. So Ben Swan, the camp director there, when I asked him about this, he put it this way. He was describing New Canaan, Connecticut, which is a town that some of the campers tend to come from each year. But really, I mean, New Canaan could be Calabasas, or it could be, San Diego. It could be Woodside, California, Highland Park, Illinois. Name your favorite place where there tends to be a lot of people who have, more money than average. He said the problem with New Canaan, Connecticut, he said, is that nobody needs you in New Canaan. Here at camp, on these 2.5 acres in the middle of the lake, everyone is needed because the only fun that we have is the fun that we create. And to me, the lesson of the best sorts of camps, of getting kids away from all that surrounds them, all of the stuff during the year, is that lesson. The idea that we don't actually need all of that stuff to be happy, and we can do just fine with a lot less. You don't even need walls separating the toilets. So in communities like these, where many families have more than average or much more than average, I often like to talk about the vacations that we take. And this all started for me with a swimming pool. I was sitting by the side of one day in the Hamptons, a very nice part of Long Island, and I was talking to a family, a couple. They had grown up working class themselves, and they had made it big. The husband was a partner in a private equity firm on Wall Street. The wife was a partner in a law firm. They lived at one of the fanciest addresses in Manhattan. They had really hit it big, and they worked really, really hard to do so. They only had time for about 2 weeks of vacation each year, and they wanted to enjoy it. And so they went to very nice places. And who could fault them? A lot of the best happiness research tells us that you should spend money lavishly, if you can afford to, on experiences, not on things, on the sorts of events that will make memories, with the people that you love, doing things that will make you happy, and that all makes sense. But one day, after one of their trips, they came home and realized, to their great alarm, that the 9-year-old and the 11-year-old were sitting on the couch discussing in fine detail the various poolside amenities at all of the Four Seasons resorts they had been to, and were comparing them. And these parents were disgusted. What have we done? They wondered. And so they decided right then and there that the vacations were going to change. And even though they could afford to go to Four Seasons resorts and other places like it, that they were going to send their kids away at least once or twice a year with their older relatives, the people who were still working class, the people who lived in Queens and Staten Island and not on Park Avenue. And it turns out that those vacations that the kids took with those relatives were very different. They would get in the car. They would drive long distances. They would go to national parks, and then they would spend the night in motels. And it turns out that the kids liked those vacations just as much, if not more. Because the way their 9-year-old explained it to them, he said, you know, when I go on those trips with Grandma and Grandpa, when I want a Coke, I can just put $1 in a vending machine and I get to press a button and the can falls down and then you pick it up and it's all fizzy and you open it up and the Coke sprays everywhere and it makes a big mess. He said, when I want a Coke at the Four Seasons, I have to pick up the phone and talk to somebody, and then a waiter comes in a tie and he's carrying the Coke in a glass on a tray, and we get charged $12 and then you get mad at me. So, you know, kids don't need all of that. It's fun. Maybe it's fun once in a while. Maybe it's fun all the time for grown-ups, and no one should feel badly for taking vacations like that. But these two parents and I, we created this little rule. They wouldn't let me name it after them because they didn't want to be named in the book, because they sort of wanted to protect their privacy. But we agreed to call it the Four Seasons rule, which says that for every trip that you take to a Four Seasons resort or a place like it, you should probably take a very different sort of trip with your kids, or at least send them on one to a very different sort of place. So this is not what they become used to. So this is not what they think they will have coming to them later. And so that they can learn how other people take trips and how other people live in other communities, and not just be around the swimming pool all the time with a frozen drink brought to them by a tuxedoed waiter with a flower in it. So parents always ask me about the cell phone question. Now, I know that this is a slightly different question in this community where there's a sort of a bring your own device policy, right? And the kids are supposed to have internet-enabled devices that they bring to school. Now, I'm not sure what sort of devices you have them bring, or whether those devices have a data plan once they leave the campus. But my feeling about smartphones, which parents ask about constantly, is actually pretty simple, which is that kids do need cell phones. Whether we like it or not, texting is how many of them communicate. Even their teachers and their coaches will communicate that way. Having a dial tone and the ability to make a phone call when the kids are off wandering around by themselves is a good thing. I do not think kids need internet access when they're on the go. They don't need Instagram. They don't need cameras. These are all things that are nice to have, but they are wants. They are not needs. And so if your kid wants to have a data plan, if they want to have a smartphone, maybe they ought to pay for it themselves. Some of you may know families that fly private. Some of you may even fly private yourself. It's great. I wish I could. I only wish I knew what it was like. But the number of parents that I've heard from in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles over the last couple of years who say to me, if I see another private jet photo in my kid's Instagram stream, I'm going to break their phone over my knee, you would not believe it. I mean, I've heard this dozens of times now. I don't know who these parents are who are letting their kids take pictures of themselves on private planes and blast them out into the universe. Well, actually, I do know. Some of you may remember the whole incident with Michael Dell's kids a couple of years ago. Yeah, the Dells were mortified, and this was sort of in the gossip pages for weeks. But there are parents who do this. And the issue isn't so much with the kids themselves. I worry more about the kids whose noses are pressed up against the glass, literally, of their phones or their tablets, looking at this. And they're at home, and all of their friends are out on Instagram, having fun at places where they're not invited to, with friends that they're not hanging out with. And all of this is sort of going on in front of them, and they're literally expected to like it, right? To press the thumbs up button on Instagram. And it's sort of a competition to see who's having the best time and getting the most likes from the most people on any given day. And if you're not out there, putting those things up, if you're the one watching, if you're the one with the fewest likes, if you're the one who maybe can't afford or doesn't get to go to those places, it can be painful. I mean, Instagram in many ways is an engine for envy. And kids, they have trouble understanding that, the version of reality that's posted on some of these Instagram feeds and Instagram streams, it's not, in fact, real at all. That social media, for many people, and particularly for kids, it's sort of a sales tool. It's a way to broadcast you're awesome. And it's not real. And so one thing I always try and remind myself, and remind parents that I talk to, that this Instagram stuff, the fancy places, the fancy things, the shopping bags, the haul videos, this is actually more damaging than commercial television ever was. And so if you think that you're kind of off scot-free once your kid has a phone and you don't really need to get between them and their media consumption, I think you're wrong. So we're in California. We got to talk about cars. The whole want-need question when it comes to a car is very complicated for parents, particularly in communities like this where many of the kids come from 10 or 20 or 30 miles away to go to school. If you have been taking your child to school for years or a decade or 15 years, getting the child a car feels very much like a need. And in fact, you may be able to make more money if you get the child a car because you've got another hour, an hour and a half, or 2 hours of your day back that you can go work. Maybe you work on commission. Maybe you get paid by the hour. Maybe you're a consultant. Maybe you can travel more. A lot of that gets easier when the kid gets a car. So let's take it as a given that a car is a need. Then you get into the question of what kind of car the child wants. Now you want them to be safe. You need them to be safe for your own peace of mind. And in the old days, this is how we kept them safe, with a 10-year-old steel tank made in Sweden. And this felt okay, this felt good. But there are still many parents out there who have convinced themselves that the only way to keep their kids safe is with a brand new car. I'm not buying it. I think if a kid wants a brand new car, they should have to contribute to it a lot, in the very least to the upkeep and the maintenance and the gas and the insurance. There are plenty of 10 and 12 and 14-year-old cars out on the road right now. I know because I drive one of them that has electronic stability control, that has all of the airbags you ever could need to protect their silly little heads when they drive like idiots. These cars are fine. And so if a kid wants a new car and they bat their eyes at you and they've gotten straight A's and you think that you need to get it for them to keep them safe, I would ask you to think twice about it. How many of you have kids who are in high school? Oh, okay, so half the room. So we should talk a little bit about college. So something strange has happened, really sort of a big change in the last 10 or 15 years without anyone really even noticing it. What's happened is this. All of a sudden, this college decision, this decision that the kids are involved in intimately, maybe they're deciding whether to take on student loans, this decision all of a sudden is a six-figure decision. To go to the flagship state university, to go to Berkeley, is probably $100,000, particularly if they don't get out in 4 years, which they probably won't. And so that's the rack rate. If they want to go to Stanford or go to Reed or go to Harvard if they're lucky, then you're looking at $250,000 or more. Now again, that's before financial aid, that's before need-based aid, that's before merit scholarship, but that is the per child price. It's crazy, right? I mean, this is maybe the most financially impactful decision that kids will ever make, that these teenagers will ever make in their entire life, and they're making it as kids, albeit with your help. but they're making the decision as mere children. I don't know how we got to this point, but here we are, and we have to get them ready. The other way to think about this, to frame this, just to think about how big of a decision this has suddenly gotten. It used to be just, again, until 10 or 15 years ago, that there were only two things that we paid for over decades as Americans, right? We would pay for our homes over decades with a 30-year mortgage or longer if we refinance. And we would pay for our retirement over decades, 20, 30, 40 years of saving, before we could finally hang it up. College used to be something that you just worked your way through. And then when it wasn't that anymore, you would work some, your parents might write a check, they would save for a little bit, but it wasn't all that expensive. Now, however, most parents, if they can possibly afford to, they start saving as soon as they're pregnant because they know they're looking at this possible $250,000 price tag per child, right? They start saving when the kid is 0. But they can't possibly save enough by the time the kid is 20, particularly if they're paying private school tuitions in most instances. And so then the kid takes on debt, and maybe the parent takes on debt. And you take on enough debt that you can't pay it off in the normal term, and so you extend the debt, and maybe you extend it to 25 years or 30 years, and pretty soon you've taken half a century to pay for college. More than it took you to save for retirement, more than it took you to pay for your mortgage. It's suddenly the longest term expenditure for any American family, and for millions and millions of them now, as more and more people borrow and as the prices go through the roof. It is crazy. So, one of the decisions that families often face when thinking about a public university versus a private university, they look at the price tag, and if they're not qualifying for much need-based financial aid, they're saying to themselves, wait a second, what we're looking at here is, the difference between $100,000 at UCSD and $250,000 at Reed or Pomona or Macalester or Kenyon or Oberlin. And they ask themselves, well, okay, so what exactly are we getting for that an additional $150,000? Or even if it's less, let's call it a plain $100,000. That is real money. That's after-tax money. That's money that you've saved for a long time. You may have more than one kid. You may have 3 kids or 4. And so all of a sudden, this number is enormous. And you're asking yourself, okay, this is probably one of the biggest decisions, if not the biggest decision, that we will ever make, that our kid will ever make. So what kind of data do we have on this? Well, it turns out there literally is no data on this. The only data that exists is a little bit of self-reported data from graduates of these colleges about what they earn. Now, the only people who raise their hands for these studies are the people who are actually earning a lot. The people who are unemployed, they don't participate in the surveys. So the data is terrible, right? And then you have to take a step back and say to yourself, wait a second, am I really going to make this decision about UCSD versus Reed or UCLA versus Carleton on the basis of whether one graduate or another has earned $3,000 more a year by the time they're 26? I mean, that seems like an awfully strange way to make a decision. But if you go looking for data on what the kids have actually learned, you'll find nothing. And if you go and look for the data on how the kids have changed, how they've fine-tuned their personalities or turned the screws in their head, or whether they're happier, you'll find nothing. And if you go and you look, or try and come up with some sort of measure of what kinds of people are they meeting, what kind of lifelong relationships are they forging, you will find nothing. The only thing you'll find is rumors and funny stories. Did anyone here go to Middlebury? Yeah, so nobody in the room. So the thing I've always heard about Middlebury over the years is that Middlebury people marry other Middlebury people more than any other college in the country. So the moral of that story has always been, I guess if you want to meet your spouse in college, you go to Middlebury. But again, that's not what most of us are thinking about when we're thinking about where to send our kids to college. There really is no decent data at all. I was talking about this recently with Susan Engel, who's a psychology professor at Williams College. She has an interest in this. She's an expert in curiosity. And the question that she asks, the curious question, is this: how can we go on defending what we do here? I mean, at the most fundamental level, we don't have any good information about how to figure this out. And maybe, just maybe, the colleges like it that way. Because then we don't know how to make the decision. And when our kids bat their eyes at us and they really want to go to the more expensive school, we decide to borrow the money to do it. Or we let them borrow the money to do it, or they make the choice to borrow the money to do it themselves. And we decide that private must be better than public, that expensive must be better than cheaper, that brands matter. We turn to snobbery. So as you've probably figured out by now, I feel really strongly about the connection between money and feelings, money and values, money and emotions, money and behavior. Feelings, it's a kid's word, right? We help kids when their feelings are hurt. We encourage them to talk about their feelings. Feelings are raw, they're embarrassing, sometimes they're uncontrollable, but we value them, we honor them, we talk about them a lot. And I think as we try to help our kids understand money, it's important for us to understand this part of the equation, right? That as we prepare them for that Berkeley decision, that Reed decision, that McAllister decision, the biggest decision of their life, all along, hopefully, we've been talking to them about wants and needs and the difference and the feelings that come up when we try and decide between the two. Because pretty soon, before too long, they're going to be making this kind of decision themselves. And hopefully, all along the way, we've helped them understand this. Thank you.